The millionaire's baby, fragile and wasting away, rejected every food offered by the finest doctors, until the humble cleaning lady, moved by desperation, offered him her own breast milk and saved his life. The marble floors of Cedars-Sinai's private wing reflected nothing but silence. At 3 in the morning, even the most prestigious medical facility in Beverly Hills felt hollow, its corridors stretching like empty promises under fluorescent lights that never dimmed. Dr. Michael Harrison stood outside room 847, his shoulders carrying the weight of 15 years in neonatal care. The chart in his hands told a story that defied every protocol he'd memorized, every solution he'd perfected. Baby Alexander Whitmore, son of tech mogul David Whitmore and socialite Victoria, was dying in the most expensive room money could buy. The irony wasn't lost on him. In his career, he'd saved premature babies with nothing but determination and outdated equipment. Now, surrounded by machines worth more than most people's homes, he was losing a perfectly healthy full-term infant to something inexplicable. Through the glass wall, he watched the Whitmores maintain their vigil. David paced near the window, his phone pressed to his ear, even at this hour, orchestrating business deals as if controlling the external world could somehow fix what was breaking inside this room. Victoria sat motionless beside the isolette, her designer clothes wrinkled from 3 days of refusing to leave, her perfectly styled hair now limp with exhaustion and unspoken fear. The baby lay still, his tiny chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. Every formula had been rejected, every feeding attempt had failed. The child simply refused to accept nutrition from any source the medical team offered. His weight was dropping, his energy was fading. Time was becoming the one commodity David Whitmore couldn't purchase. Michael had called specialists from Johns Hopkins, consulted with pediatric nutritionists from Stanford, even contacted experimental programs in Switzerland. The answer was always the same. Medically, there was no explanation. The baby's digestive system was perfect. His reflexes were normal. His blood work showed no abnormalities. Yet he was slowly starving in a room where every possible solution had been exhausted. The weight of professional failure pressed against Michael's chest. He'd built his reputation on solving the impossible, on being the doctor other doctors called when hope seemed lost. Parents traveled across continents to place their children under his care. Medical journals published his innovative techniques. Awards lined his office walls. None of it mattered now. As he watched David's animated phone conversation and Victoria's hollow stare, Michael understood that some problems couldn't be solved with expertise, technology, or money. Some mysteries required something else entirely, something that perhaps existed beyond the sterile boundaries of institutional medicine. He just didn't know what that something was. The 4th day brought no miracles, only deeper silence. Michael found himself returning to room 847 every hour, as if his presence alone could will the child back to health. The medical team had begun speaking in hushed tones, their confident voices replaced by careful euphemisms and measured concerns. Baby Alexander's condition had stabilized at a dangerous plateau, not improving, not dramatically worsening, but existing in a liminal space that felt more terrifying than crisis. His tiny fists remained clenched, his eyes closed more often than open, as if he were retreating from a world that couldn't nourish him. Michael stood at his office window, overlooking the manicured gardens that separated the hospital from the sprawling mansions of Beverly Hills. The contrast felt cruel, abundance everywhere except where it mattered most. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to care about small comforts when every decision felt monumental. The knock on his door was soft, almost apologetic. David Whitmore entered without waiting for permission, his usual commanding presence diminished by sleepless nights and helplessness. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his perfectly groomed appearance showing cracks that no amount of wealth could conceal. "Dr. Harrison," David's voice carried a tremor he was fighting to suppress. "I need to know." Honestly, what are my son's chances? Michael had rehearsed this conversation in his mind dozens of times, but facing David's desperate eyes made every prepared phrase feel inadequate. Mr. Whitmore, medically speaking, your son is stable. His vital signs are— That's not what I asked. David's interruption was sharp, cutting through professional courtesy. I've spent the last 3 days listening to medical jargon. I need the truth. Will my son live? The silence that followed felt heavier than any answer. Michael had delivered devastating news before, had learned to balance honesty with hope, but this situation defied every framework he'd developed. How do you explain failure when every test shows perfection? How do you admit defeat when you've exhausted every possibility except the ones that haven't been invented yet? I don't know, Michael finally admitted, the words tasting like surrender. I've never seen anything like this. Your son should be thriving. Every indicator suggests he's healthy, but— David's composure cracked visibly. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment the billionaire tech mogul looked like nothing more than a terrified father watching his child slip away from him. I've built my career solving impossible problems. I've created technologies that didn't exist, found solutions that experts said were impossible. But this— He gestured helplessly toward the window, toward the room where his son lay fighting a battle no one understood. Money doesn't matter here, does it? David's question was barely a whisper. Michael shook his head slowly. I wish it did. I wish I could tell you to write a check and we'd have an answer tomorrow. But some things can't be bought, David finished, his voice hollow with the recognition of his own powerlessness. They stood together in silence, two men accustomed to control, facing the humbling reality that expertise and resources meant nothing when confronted with genuine mystery. Outside, the California sun continued its predictable arc across a sky that seemed indifferent to human suffering. By the 5th night, Michael had stopped going home. His office couch had become a makeshift bed, his desk a collection of medical journals he'd read and reread, searching for something he might have missed. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the weight of questions that had no answers. The hospital's night shift moved around him like ghosts. Nurses checked on him with concerned glances, bringing coffee he didn't drink and suggesting rest he couldn't take. The cleaning staff worked quietly, their presence barely registering in his consciousness as he pored over case studies and experimental research from around the world. Victoria Whitmore had finally agreed to brief rests, collapsing into the private suite adjacent to the nursery for 2-hour intervals before returning to her vigil. David divided his time between phone calls with medical consultants and standing motionless beside his son's isolette, as if he could will life into the child through sheer determination. The baby's weight had dropped another ounce. In the world of neonatal care, every gram mattered. Every day without proper nutrition brought them closer to irreversible damage, to complications that would follow Alexander for the rest of his life, if he survived to have a life at all. Michael found himself questioning everything: his training, his experience, his fundamental understanding of medicine. In medical school, they'd taught him that for every problem there was a solution waiting to be discovered. That persistence and knowledge would eventually yield answers. That failure was simply an indication that he hadn't looked hard enough, tried enough options, or applied enough creativity to the challenge. But what if they were wrong? What if some problems existed beyond the reach of human understanding, beyond the scope of medical intervention? The thought terrified him more than any diagnosis he'd ever delivered. He walked the halls at 3 in the morning, his footsteps echoing in corridors that felt like a maze without exits. The expensive artwork on the walls, the gleaming equipment, the marble floors, all of it felt like a beautiful facade concealing an ugly truth. They were losing a battle they didn't even understand, and all their tools, all their expertise, all their resources were proving worthless against an enemy they couldn't identify. In the nurse's station, he overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. Two pediatric nurses discussing a case from another hospital. Another baby with feeding difficulties who had eventually responded to a treatment protocol that shouldn't have worked according to established science. Sometimes, one of them was saying, the answer isn't in the textbook. Sometimes you have to look beyond what you think you know. The words followed him back to his office, where he sat in the dark, staring at the wall of diplomas and certifications that suddenly felt like monuments to inadequacy. He had dedicated his life to understanding how to save children, and when it mattered most, when a child's life hung in the balance, all his knowledge felt hollow. Through his window, dawn was beginning to break over Beverly Hills, painting the sky in shades of hope he couldn't feel. Another day was beginning, and with it, another 24 hours of watching Alexander Whitmore slowly fade away while he stood by, helpless and educated and completely, utterly useless. Carmen Delgado had been invisible for 15 years. She arrived at Cedars-Sinai every morning at 4:30 a.m., her presence marked only by the gradual transformation of chaos into order. Floors that had witnessed the day's tragedies would gleam by dawn. Rooms that had held desperation would smell of hope and disinfectant. At 35, she moved through the hospital's corridors like a ghost who cared. Her uniform was always pressed, her hair pulled back in a neat bun that revealed the quiet dignity she carried despite her circumstances. Doctors passed her without acknowledgement. Nurses nodded politely but never lingered for conversation. She was part of the hospital's infrastructure, as essential and overlooked as the electrical wiring that kept the lights on. Carmen had learned to read the emotional temperature of rooms before she entered them. 15 years of cleaning up after human drama had taught her to recognize the weight of grief, the sharp edge of panic, the hollow silence of families waiting for news that might never come. She approached room 847 with the same careful attention she gave to every space under her care. The Whitmore family's vigil had been ongoing for 6 days now. Carmen had watched it unfold in fragments, glimpses caught while emptying trash bins, conversations overheard while replacing linens. She knew, as cleaning staff always knew, that the situation was dire. Babies who stopped eating didn't survive long, regardless of how much money surrounded them. What she hadn't expected was the way the sight of baby Alexander affected her. As she quietly wiped down surfaces, trying to maintain her professional invisibility, her eyes kept returning to the isolette where the infant lay. His tiny face was peaceful but too still, his breathing shallow but steady. Every maternal instinct she possessed screamed that this child was hungry, desperate, slowly starving despite being surrounded by the most advanced medical care money could buy. 3 months ago, Carmen had lost her own baby at 36 weeks. A stillbirth that had arrived without warning, without explanation, without the mercy of preparation. She had returned to work after a week because she couldn't afford longer, because grief was a luxury her financial situation wouldn't accommodate, because staying busy was the only way to keep the pain from consuming her completely. Her body had betrayed her by continuing to produce milk for a child who would never need it. The physical reminder of loss that arrived every few hours, the literal weight of unused maternal capability that made her breasts ache and her heart break in rhythm. She had been dealing with this private agony in bathroom stalls and supply closets, expressing milk that had nowhere to go, disposing of the evidence of her phantom motherhood in silence. Now, watching Alexander Whitmore fight a battle he was losing, Carmen felt something shift inside her chest. A recognition that transcended logic, an understanding that existed beyond the boundaries of social class, professional protocol, and medical expertise. She knew what hunger looked like. She knew what a child needed when everything else had failed. And she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that she might be carrying the one thing this baby required for survival. The knowledge sat in her chest like a secret too dangerous to speak, too important to ignore. The moment arrived without ceremony, hidden within the ordinary rhythm of Carmen's morning routine. She had finished cleaning the family consultation room and was preparing to service room 847 when she heard it, a sound that stopped her completely. Baby Alexander was crying. Not the weak, intermittent protest she'd heard over the past days, but a deep, desperate wail that seemed to pull something primal from the air itself. It was the sound of a child who had moved beyond discomfort into genuine distress, beyond medical monitoring into existential hunger. Through the glass wall, she could see Dr. Harrison and a nurse attempting another feeding. Victoria Whitmore sat in the corner, her hands pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son reject yet another carefully formulated attempt at nutrition. David stood by the window, his back turned to the scene, his shoulders rigid with the effort of containing his helplessness. The crying continued, each note seeming to slice through the expensive silence of the private wing. Carmen found herself frozen in the doorway, her cleaning cart forgotten, her professional invisibility momentarily abandoned as every maternal instinct in her body responded to the sound of a starving child. She watched Dr. Harrison's hands shake slightly as he withdrew the feeding tube. The defeat in his movements was visible, the weight of failed attempts beginning to crush his professional confidence. The nurse spoke in quiet, measured tones, but Carmen could read the resignation in her body language. Alexander's cries grew weaker, transitioning from desperate demand to exhausted protest. His tiny fists waved in the air with diminishing energy, and Carmen recognized the terrible progression she'd witnessed too many times. Hope fading into acceptance, fight dissolving into surrender. Without thinking, without planning, without considering the consequences of her visibility, Carmen stepped into the room. Her movement was so quiet that none of the family noticed initially. She approached the isolette with the same careful attention she brought to all her tasks, her eyes fixed on Alexander's face. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Harrison looked up, startled by the interruption. His expression shifted from surprise to mild irritation. This was a private moment, a medical crisis, not an appropriate time for housekeeping concerns. "I'm sorry, but we're in the middle of—" "I can help him," Carmen interrupted, the words leaving her mouth before she could stop them. The boldness of her statement shocked even her, but Alexander's cries had stripped away her usual caution. The room fell silent, except for the baby's continued distress. Victoria looked up for the first time in hours, her tear-streaked face reflecting confusion and desperate hope. David turned from the window, his businessman's skepticism warring with a father's willingness to consider any possibility. Dr. Harrison's professional training kicked in immediately. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a complex medical situation. We have the best specialists." "I lost my baby 3 months ago," Carmen said, her voice steady despite the way the words cut through her chest. "I still have milk. Sometimes babies know what they need." The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything the room represented. Medicine, expertise, protocol, social hierarchy, all of it suspended while a grieving mother offered the one thing no amount of money could buy. The silence that followed Carmen's offer stretched beyond discomfort into something deeper, a moment where social conventions, medical protocols, and human desperation collided in ways none of them had been prepared for. Dr. Harrison's first instinct was to dismiss the suggestion entirely. The liability issues alone were staggering, not to mention the breach of every hospital policy he could imagine. But Alexander's weakening cries cut through his professional caution, and he found himself considering something that should have been impossible. "That's—" he began, then stopped. The word inappropriate felt cruel in the face of Carmen's quiet courage and the child's obvious distress. "There are regulations, safety concerns, legal—" "Doctor!" Victoria's voice was barely audible, but it carried a weight that stopped everyone in the room. She had risen from her chair and was looking directly at Carmen for the first time. What's your name? Carmen. Carmen Delgado. Carmen, Victoria repeated, as if testing how the name felt in her mouth. You work here? 15 years. I clean the rooms, the halls. Carmen's voice trailed off as she realized how inadequate her credentials sounded in this moment, but she kept her eyes on Alexander, whose cries had softened to exhausted whimpers. David stepped closer to the isolette, his businessman's mind working through calculations that had nothing to do with profit margins. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Carmen said carefully, that sometimes medicine doesn't have all the answers. Sometimes. She looked directly at Alexander, whose tiny hand had opened and closed, as if grasping for something beyond reach. Sometimes babies know what they need. Dr. Harrison found himself caught between everything he'd been trained to believe and the undeniable reality that every conventional approach had failed. The baby was dying slowly, measurably, despite access to the most advanced neonatal care in the world. At what point did caution become complicity in that failure? The risks, he began. What risks? David's interruption was sharp. You've told me my son might not survive. Every day he gets weaker, every feeding fails. What exactly are we protecting him from? Carmen reached into the isolette without asking permission, her hand settling gently on Alexander's chest. The touch was instinctive, maternal, the kind of contact that existed before hospitals and protocols and the medicalization of motherhood. Alexander's crying stopped abruptly, his body responding to a warmth and presence that felt different from gloved hands and clinical precision. He knows, Carmen whispered, her voice filled with a certainty that transcended her humble position in the hospital hierarchy. He knows what he needs. Victoria stood shakily and approached the isolette. For the first time since giving birth, she looked at another woman and saw not a threat or competition, but a possibility. How would this work? Dr. Harrison felt the weight of decision pressing against his chest. Everything in his training screamed against what was being proposed, but everything in his experience with Alexander suggested that conventional wisdom had already failed. The child needed something they couldn't provide, something that existed beyond the boundaries of medical science. Looking at Carmen's steady gaze, at David's desperate hope, at Victoria's fragile courage, and at baby Alexander's suddenly peaceful face, under the touch of someone who understood hunger in ways none of them could, Dr. Harrison realized that sometimes the most profound medical decisions happened in the spaces between protocols, in the moments when humanity demanded more than expertise could offer. What happened next defied every rule Dr. Harrison had spent 15 years following, yet felt more natural than any medical procedure he'd ever performed. Carmen lifted Alexander from his isolette with movements so gentle they seemed choreographed by instinct. The baby, who had rejected every form of nutrition for 6 days, settled against her chest with immediate recognition. His tiny body relaxed in ways the medical team hadn't seen since his birth. Victoria watched from across the room, her hands pressed against her mouth, caught between gratitude and something that felt dangerously close to jealousy. This stranger was providing comfort she hadn't been able to offer her own child. Doctor. Harrison found himself documenting something he couldn't officially acknowledge. The baby's heart rate stabilized instantly. His breathing deepened. The tension that had marked every moment of his short life simply disappeared. When Carmen began to nurse him, Alexander latched immediately with the desperation of a child who had been waiting for exactly this moment. His small hands gripped her uniform with surprising strength, and for the first time since his birth, he fed with the urgency of genuine hunger being satisfied. "My God," David whispered, his voice cracking. "Look at him." The transformation was immediate and undeniable. Color returned to Alexander's face. His body settled into the rhythm of feeding that every parent recognizes, but no medical textbook can fully explain. Carmen held him with the practiced ease of someone who understood that feeding a child was about more than nutrition. It was about connection, comfort, and the fundamental human need to be held while being nourished. Dr. Harrison watched his monitors register improvements that contradicted everything he thought he knew about infant feeding disorders. Heart rate optimal, oxygen saturation perfect. The child who had been slowly dying was now thriving in the arms of a woman whose only credential was loss. Victoria stepped closer, her eyes fixed on her son's peaceful face. "How long have you known?" she asked Carmen softly. Known what? That this was what he needed. Carmen considered the question while Alexander continued feeding, his tiny body completely relaxed for the first time in his life, since the first day I saw him. But knowing and being able to do something about it, those are different things. The weight of that distinction settled over the room. Carmen had spent 6 days watching a child starve while carrying the solution in her own body, held back by invisible barriers that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with social hierarchies that suddenly seemed absurd. David's phone rang, but for the first time in days, he didn't answer it. His attention was entirely focused on his son, who was feeding with the contentment of a child who had finally found what he needed. But even as relief flooded the room, Dr. Harrison felt a new kind of pressure building. This miracle had no protocol, no precedent, no framework for what came next. The euphoria lasted exactly 47 minutes. That's how long it took for hospital administrator Robert Kellner to receive word of the irregular feeding protocol being implemented in room 847. His arrival was preceded by the sharp sound of expensive shoes on marble floors and an energy that turned the peaceful room cold. "Dr. Harrison." Kellner's voice carried the kind of authority that came from controlling budgets and liability insurance. "I need to speak with you immediately." Carmen felt Alexander tense against her chest, as if he could sense the shift in the room's atmosphere. She instinctively adjusted her hold on him, creating a protective barrier with her body. "Mr. Kellner, as you can see, the patient is responding remarkably well to... The patient is being fed by an unlicensed, unscreened individual in direct violation of hospital policy, state health regulations, and basic medical safety protocols." Kellner's eyes swept the room, cataloguing violations with the efficiency of someone who saw liability in every human gesture. David stepped forward, his businessman's instincts recognizing a territorial challenge. "My son is eating for the first time in 6 days. Your protocols were killing him. Mr. Whitmore, I understand your emotional investment, but we have procedures for a reason. This woman has not been tested for communicable diseases, has not been cleared by our medical staff, and represents an enormous legal liability for this institution." Carmen's grip on Alexander tightened protectively. She had been invisible in this hospital for 15 years, cleaning up after other people's emergencies, witnessing other people's miracles. Now, holding this child who needed her, she found herself at the center of a battle she didn't understand, but instinctively knew she was losing. "What diseases?" Victoria's voice was quiet, but sharp. "What exactly are you afraid of?" Kellner consulted his tablet with practiced efficiency. "Hepatitis, HIV, drug use, mental health status, criminal background checks, employment verification. None of the standard screening protocols have been followed." Dr. Harrison felt his medical judgment being dissected by administrative concerns that had nothing to do with healing. "The child is thriving. For the first time since birth, he's feeding naturally. His vital signs are optimal." "Dr. Harrison, your job is to practice medicine within the legal and ethical framework this institution provides. This situation creates exposure that could cost us millions in lawsuits, not to mention our accreditation status if the state licensing board decides to investigate." Carmen understood, with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of being dismissed, that she was about to be removed from Alexander's life. The miracle was being reduced to a legal problem, the solution reframed as a liability. She looked down at the baby in her arms, who had settled into the kind of peaceful sleep that had eluded him since birth, and felt her heart breaking for the second time in 3 months. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long what?" Kellner's impatience was barely concealed. "How long does he have if I stop feeding him?" The question hung in the room like a blade. Because they all knew the answer. Without Carmen, Alexander would return to his slow starvation, surrounded by the best medical care money could buy, but lacking the one thing his body would accept. "We'll find another solution," Kellner said, but his words carried no conviction. The battle lines were drawn in whispered conversations and legal consultations that stretched through the night. Carmen had been allowed to continue feeding Alexander under temporary emergency provisions, while teams of lawyers, administrators, and medical ethicists debated the precedent they were setting. Dr. Harrison found himself defending a decision that challenged everything he'd been taught about institutional medicine. In conference rooms filled with people who had never touched a starving child, he argued for the validity of outcomes over protocols, for the evidence of Alexander's thriving over the comfort of established procedures. Carmen sat in the family room adjacent to the nursery, Alexander sleeping peacefully in her arms after his 3rd successful feeding. Victoria sat across from her, and for the first time since giving birth, she looked directly at the woman who was keeping her son alive. "I should hate you," Victoria said quietly. Carmen's eyes remained fixed on Alexander's face. "Maybe you should. You're doing what I can't do. You're saving him in ways I never could. That should make me grateful. But instead," Victoria's voice trailed off, "instead it makes you feel like less of a mother," Carmen finished. The honesty of the statement hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had been struggling with feelings she couldn't name, watching another woman provide for her child what she desperately wanted to give but couldn't. The guilt of that inadequacy had been eating at her alongside her gratitude. "I produce milk," Victoria whispered. "The doctors say it's perfectly good milk, but he won't take it. He won't even try. What kind of mother does that make me?" Carmen shifted Alexander carefully, then reached across the space between them to touch Victoria's hand. "It makes you a mother whose baby has specific needs that have nothing to do with your worth or your love. Some children need things their parents can't provide. That doesn't make the love less real." Through the window, they could see David in heated conversation with a team of hospital lawyers. His gestures were sharp, his frustration visible even through the glass. The man who had built an empire on solving impossible problems was discovering that some solutions couldn't be negotiated or purchased. "They want to remove you," Victoria said. "I know. They want to find a medical alternative, something that fits their policies." "I know. And if they can't?" Carmen looked down at Alexander, whose tiny hand had wrapped around her finger during his sleep. The trust in that grip was absolute, the kind of faith that existed before disappointment taught caution. "Then your son goes back to starving, and everyone will feel better about following the rules." The cruelty of that reality settled between them. Carmen would be returned to her invisibility, her essential role dismissed in favor of systemic comfort. Alexander would return to his slow decline, surrounded by expertise that couldn't nourish him. And everyone involved would be protected from liability, except the child who needed protection most. Victoria stood suddenly, her decision crystallizing with a clarity that surprised her. "No, this stops now." She walked to the window and knocked sharply on the glass. When David looked up, she gestured for him to join them. The lawyers would have to wait. David entered the room to find his wife standing with a determination he hadn't seen since before Alexander's birth. Victoria's transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders were straight, her voice steady, and her eyes held the kind of clarity that comes from choosing a side in a battle you can't afford to lose. "We're keeping her," Victoria announced without preamble. David glanced between his wife and Carmen, who continued to hold their sleeping son. "Victoria, the legal complications—" "I don't care about the legal complications. I care about our son living." Victoria's voice carried a finality that stopped David's business-minded objections before they formed. "Look at him, David. Really look at him." David did look, and what he saw challenged every assumption he'd held about problems and solutions. Alexander was peaceful in a way that had nothing to do with medical intervention. His breathing was natural, his color healthy, his body relaxed against Carmen's chest with complete trust. This was what contentment looked like, something no amount of money had been able to purchase. "The hospital administration won't allow it," David said, but his conviction was wavering. "Then we'll leave the hospital," Victoria replied with stunning simplicity. The statement hung in the air like a revolution disguised as common sense. Carmen looked up sharply, understanding the magnitude of what Victoria was suggesting. Leaving Cedars-Sinai meant abandoning the security of constant medical monitoring, the comfort of having specialists available around the clock, the safety net of institutional medicine. "Victoria, that's—" David struggled to process his wife's suggestion. "Alexander needs medical supervision. If something goes wrong—" Something was going wrong. For 6 days, something was going wrong while we had the best medical supervision money could buy. He was dying here, David. Dying while surrounded by experts who couldn't help him. Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway, his face showing the strain of the night's debates. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I need to speak with you about the administration's decision." "We already know," Victoria said before he could continue, "and we've made our own decision. I'm not sure you understand the full scope of what's being proposed. The hospital is willing to find a compromise, supervised feedings, contracted lactation services with proper screening protocols. Supervised by people who were willing to watch our son starve rather than break their rules." David's businessman pragmatism was beginning to align with his wife's maternal instincts. "Doctor, I appreciate everything you've tried to do, but institutions have interests that don't always align with individual needs." Carmen spoke for the first time since David had entered the room. "I can't ask you to leave this hospital because of me. I'm just—" She searched for words to describe her place in this impossible situation. "I'm just someone who happened to be able to help." "You're not just anything," Victoria said firmly. "You're the person who saved our son's life when no one else could. That makes you essential, not incidental." The weight of that recognition settled over Carmen like a responsibility she wasn't sure she could bear. For 15 years, she had been replaceable, invisible, a service provider whose personal life remained carefully separate from her work. Now she was being asked to become central to a family's survival, to cross boundaries that had never been crossed, to matter in ways that terrified her. Alexander stirred in her arms, and instinctively, all 4 adults fell silent, watching to see what he needed. The transition happened faster than anyone expected. Within 12 hours, the Whitmore family had transformed their Beverly Hills mansion into a private medical facility, complete with monitoring equipment, a consulting pediatrician, and Carmen Delgado installed in the guest wing with a salary that made her question if she was still living in the same world. Carmen stood in her new room, larger than her entire apartment, holding Alexander while he fed with the same contentment he'd shown at the hospital. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see manicured gardens that stretched beyond her ability to calculate their value. Everything felt surreal, as if she'd stepped through a mirror into a life that belonged to someone else. Victoria knocked softly before entering, carrying a cup of tea that cost more than Carmen's usual weekly groceries. The gesture was small, but it represented something larger, an acknowledgement that Carmen's presence here was about more than just her biological function. "How are you settling in?" Victoria asked, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I keep thinking someone's going to wake me up," Carmen admitted. "3 days ago I was cleaning hospital floors. Now you're keeping our son alive. That deserves more recognition than we know how to give." They sat in comfortable silence while Alexander continued feeding. The weight of their new arrangement was still settling around them. The way Carmen's entire life had been reorganized around the feeding schedule of a child who wasn't biologically hers. The way the Whitmore household had restructured itself around the needs of someone who had been invisible just days before. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said quietly. Carmen nodded. "When you lost your baby, how did you survive it?" The question hit Carmen unexpectedly, opening a wound she'd been carefully managing. "You don't survive it. You just keep breathing, keep moving, hope that someday the breathing gets easier." "Does it get easier?" Carmen looked down at Alexander, whose tiny hand rested against her chest as he fed. "It gets different. Some days I forget for a few minutes. Other days the missing feels so heavy I don't know how to carry it. But holding him—" She paused, searching for words that could explain the complexity of nurturing another woman's child while grieving her own. "It doesn't fix anything, but it makes the pain useful instead of just destructive." Dr. Harrison's daily visits had become routine, his initial skepticism replaced by professional fascination. Alexander was thriving in ways that challenged every assumption about infant care. His weight was optimal, his development ahead of schedule, his attachment to Carmen so complete that he became distressed when separated from her for more than short periods. David spent his evenings in the nursery, watching his son with a wonder that business success had never provided. The man who had built his fortune on predictable algorithms was learning to find comfort in the mystery of his child's specific needs. But underneath the success story, Carmen felt a growing unease. The arrangement that had saved Alexander's life was becoming something else, a dependence that she wasn't sure was healthy for any of them. She was becoming central to a family structure in ways that felt both essential and unsustainable. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Alexander slept peacefully in her arms, Carmen wondered what happened when children grew up and no longer needed the specific gifts their caregivers provided. What happened when temporary solutions became permanent dependencies? What happened when being essential became another kind of invisibility, not ignored, but consumed? The crisis came at 6 weeks, disguised as routine. Carmen woke with a fever that made her entire body ache, a simple flu that would have meant nothing to anyone else. But for Alexander, who had never accepted nutrition from any other source, her illness represented potential catastrophe. Dr. Harrison arrived within an hour of Victoria's panicked call, bringing equipment to monitor both Carmen and Alexander while they worked through contingency plans that nobody wanted to implement. Carmen lay in bed, fighting symptoms that felt minor compared to the weight of knowing that Alexander's survival depended on her recovery. "We need to try formula again, Doctor," Harrison said gently, but his tone carried the resignation of someone who had exhausted this option months ago. Alexander's reaction was immediate and devastating. He refused every alternative with the same desperate crying that had marked his first days of life. His tiny body seemed to recognize that something fundamental had changed, and his distress filled the house with a sound that broke everyone's heart. David paced the nursery like a caged animal, his businessman's need for solutions colliding with a reality that offered none. Victoria held their son while he cried, tears streaming down her own face as she watched him reject everything she could offer. "This can't be the only way," David said, his voice cracking under the weight of helplessness. "There has to be another option, another solution." Carmen, despite her fever and exhaustion, asked to hold Alexander. When Victoria placed him in her arms, his crying softened immediately, but his refusal to feed remained absolute. Her illness had changed something essential, the taste, the composition, the very essence of what he needed from her. "I'm poisoning him," Carmen whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "My body is sick, and now he can't." "No," Victoria said firmly. "You're not poisoning him. You're sick. There's a difference." But the distinction felt meaningless as they watched Alexander grow weaker over the next 12 hours. Carmen's fever broke by the second day, but Alexander's trust in her nourishment didn't return immediately. He would latch, then pull away, confused by changes in her body that he couldn't understand, but instinctively rejected. It was during this crisis that Carmen understood the true weight of her position. She wasn't just essential to Alexander's survival, she was trapped by it. Her body, her health, her very existence had become indistinguishable from his needs. She couldn't be sick, couldn't take medication that might affect her milk, couldn't live a life that existed independently of his survival. On the third day, as Alexander finally began accepting her again, Carmen made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "We need to find another way," she announced during Dr. Harrison's evening visit. "Carmen, he's feeding again. His weight is stabilizing," Victoria began. "I can't be his only option forever. What happens when I get really sick? What happens when he's older and I'm not? What happens if something happens to me?" The questions hung in the air like possibilities nobody wanted to consider. David stopped his pacing. Victoria clutched Alexander more tightly. "Doctor." Harrison nodded slowly, understanding that Carmen was confronting the unsustainability of their current arrangement. "I won't abandon him," Carmen continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "But we need to find a way for him to survive without being completely dependent on me, for his sake as much as mine." The solution came through collaboration rather than crisis, built over weeks of careful experimentation and growing trust. "Doctor." Harrison worked with nutritional specialists to develop a formula that incorporated elements of Carmen's milk, creating a bridge between her irreplaceable nourishment and sustainable alternatives. Alexander's acceptance of the hybrid feeding system was gradual but definitive. By 3 months old, he was taking bottles from Victoria and David, though he still preferred Carmen for his evening feeding. The desperation that had marked his early days was replaced by the healthy adaptability of a child who felt secure in his world. Carmen found herself with something she hadn't expected: choice. For the first time since Alexander's birth, she could leave the house for more than brief errands. She could visit her own family, could consider her own needs, could exist as something more than an extension of someone else's survival. The Whitmore Foundation for Infant Nutrition Research was established quietly, without media fanfare or self-congratulation. Carmen became its first consultant, her experience with Alexander forming the basis for studies into individualized infant nutrition needs. Her salary reflected her expertise rather than her desperation. Victoria's relationship with her son deepened as his dependency on Carmen became less absolute. She could feed him, comfort him, meet his needs in ways that restored her confidence in her own motherhood. The jealousy that had characterized her early feelings toward Carmen transformed into genuine gratitude and something approaching friendship. David discovered that the most important problem he'd ever solved hadn't required algorithms or market analysis, but simply the wisdom to recognize when conventional approaches needed to be abandoned in favor of human solutions. Dr. Harrison published papers on individualized infant care that challenged established feeding protocols, using Alexander's case as evidence that medical flexibility could save lives when rigid adherence to standards failed. But the most significant transformation was Carmen's growing understanding that being essential didn't require sacrificing herself completely. She could be central to Alexander's well-being without losing her own identity, could provide irreplaceable care without becoming irreplaceably trapped. On quiet evenings, when she fed Alexander his final bottle of the day, Carmen would think about the baby she'd lost and the child she'd helped save. The grief remained, but it had transformed into something that served life rather than mourning death. Her loss had created capacity for love that saved another child, and that child's survival had given her loss meaning beyond tragedy. Alexander thrived not just physically, but emotionally, surrounded by adults who had learned that family could be created through choice rather than biology, that care could transcend social boundaries, and that sometimes the most profound solutions came from the most unexpected sources. Carmen never forgot that she had been invisible for 15 years. Before Alexander needed her, she had become seen because she had something essential to offer, and she had remained seen because she offered it with wisdom rather than desperation. 2 years later, Carmen watched Alexander take his first steps across the Whitmore family's living room, his chubby hands reaching toward her with the confidence of a child who had never doubted that the people he loved would be there to catch him. The boy, who had once been unable to accept nourishment from anyone but her, now ate with enthusiasm, played with boundless energy, and spoke his first words to a household that had reorganized itself around love rather than desperation. But she also understood that visibility earned through genuine necessity was different from recognition demanded through ego or ambition. Mama Calm, he called her, a title that acknowledged her unique place in his life without diminishing Victoria's role as his mother. Victoria had given birth to a daughter 6 months earlier, Elena, who fed naturally from the moment of birth, reminding everyone that Alexander's needs had been specific to him rather than reflective of any universal inadequacy. Carmen had been present for Eleanor's birth, not as hired help, but as chosen family, holding Victoria's hand through contractions and welcoming the new baby with the joy of someone who understood that each child was a separate miracle. The foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations, providing research grants and support services for families dealing with unusual infant feeding challenges. Carmen traveled frequently now, consulting with hospitals and families across the country, her expertise recognized not despite her humble background, but because of the wisdom that came from direct experience with what really mattered. Dr. Harrison had left Cedars-Sinai to join the foundation full-time, his practice now focused on cases where conventional medicine needed to be supplemented with creative, individualized approaches. He often said that Alexander had taught him more about healing than 15 years of traditional practice. David's business empire continued to thrive, but his definition of success had fundamentally changed. The man who had once measured achievement in profits and market dominance now found his greatest satisfaction in the foundation's work and in watching his children grow up surrounded by people who chose to love them. Carmen's apartment had been transformed from a place of survival into a space of comfort and choice. Her mother had moved from criticism to pride, finally understanding that her daughter's work represented service rather than servitude. Carmen's evenings were her own again, but she chose to spend many of them with the Whitmore family, reading stories to Alexander and helping Victoria with Eleanor. On Alexander's 2nd birthday, as the family gathered around a cake that he attacked with typical toddler enthusiasm, Carmen felt a peace that had been missing from her life since her own loss. The grief remained, it would always remain, but it had been transformed into something that served life rather than mourning death. She watched Alexander smear frosting across his face while babbling happily to his parents, his sister, and his Mama Calm, and understood that some problems couldn't be solved with money or expertise or institutional protocols. Some solutions required nothing more complex than recognizing what was needed and having the courage to provide it, regardless of whether it fit established categories. The family she had helped create bore no resemblance to traditional structures, but it worked with a harmony that traditional approaches had failed to achieve. Love had proven more flexible than law, compassion more powerful than protocol, and human connection more essential than any technology money could buy. As evening approached and Alexander settled into her lap for his bedtime story, Carmen knew that she had found something rarer than professional recognition or financial security. She had found her place in a world that finally saw her not as invisible help, but as irreplaceably herself.